Thank you so much for coming. My name is Tony Marie. I'm a staff member here at WIF. I'm truly so excited for tonight's rendition of our monthly speaker series, which is generously supported by the West Hollywood Arts Commission. Tonight, we're hosting what's to be the first in a series of programming centered around and networking sessions for members of our community that identify as Latin. And we're so eager to kick off this evening with these two amazing leaders in our industry, production powerhouses. And next, our panelists will be taking questions. So make sure you post them in the Q&A window at the bottom of the screen. So if you look down there, you'll see that it says Q&A. You can type in some questions and leave those anonymous if you so choose. So without further ado, I'm really excited to introduce you to our panelists this evening. Adriana Martinez Barron, currently Vice President of Film at Eva Longoria's Unbelievable Entertainment, where she recently executive produced the film Let's Get Married, starring Michelle Prada, Zosha Rockmore, Taj Mowry for Viacom CBS, which will premiere on VH1 on December 13th. So tune in, it's gonna be really exciting. And talking with her tonight, we have Greta Talia Fuentes, who serves as Vice President of Production and Development at Macro. And in her current position, so badass, pardon my French. She identifies, cultivates, and shepherds a multicultural slate of projects from development through production. And tonight we're going to be moderated by none other than Rebecca Theodore Vachon, a film and TV critic who focuses on race, gender, and representation in Hollywood. So we're really excited for this conversation. I'm going to let it happen. Rebecca, take us away.
Sure. Hello, everybody. Thank you for tuning in. So I guess my first question to Greta and Adriana, how would you characterize your personal or your professional approach in supporting Latinx creators?
I think it comes from just a lot of different community building that Adriana and I take part in together. I think just from different friends and relationships in the industry, from other execs suggesting people, recommending people to know. But then I think a lot of it is to just getting in the habit of looking in different places to find different creatives, whether they're Latinx or not. So obviously like tracking festivals and, you know, being a part of mentorship programs and going to the Latinx focused festivals like Lali for things with Nalib, things like that. Yeah, I think there's a lot of different ways that we kind of find people.
How about you, Adriana?
No, absolutely. I think everything that Greta says is true. I think for us, since we are such active members of our community, we get exposed to more writers, particularly for me, Latinx writers, because that is the mandate of the company where I work for. And that is what we're very aggressively looking for. And so, and that's also, I identify as Latina and Mexican. And so like, those are the kind of writers that I also want to be working with at this point in my career. And so I've heard from a lot of executives that it's really hard to find Latinx writers. And that can be true if you're talking to the wrong reps or people who do not necessarily have a lot of diversity within their client list. But because Greta and I are also very, Greta even more than me, but like very aggressively intertwined in the Latinx community, we just have a lot of friends and our friends recommend other friends. And we just kind of know each other and know the community and are tracking it. And it's something that we do very intentionally because that is what we're both looking for. Greta, obviously, even more multiculturally than me focusing just on Latino.
Great. So are there the projects that you're attracted to or that catch your eye? Do you notice that there are specific themes or certain elements that you're looking for in stories that you're just like, yes, I feel like this is a great project for Latinx representation?
Well, it's two things. So like, obviously I have my personal taste and then I have the company taste. And for me, when I look at a project through the lens of our company, I'm looking for things that feel commercial, aspirational, that can fit in with Eva's brand. I try to look for things that are female forward, and that have like fun. I use the word fun, but what I mean is like entertaining, and we are looking for things that have that commercial appeal. And then I have my personal taste, and my personal taste comes from like looking for things that have a little bit of depth. So even though something can be commercial, I like for something to be about something, and to actually have some sort of emotional core and truth underneath it. And Greta knows I'm a very emotional person, and I feel things deeply, and I look for things that move me emotionally. And so I think what we're looking for is a combination of like things that are super commercial and entertainment and aspirational, and that represent the Latino community in a way that that doesn't feel like we're perpetuating stereotypes, or that we're focusing on just the trauma porn of it all. And we're actually like elevating the way we're representing the community. And then also that whatever story that we watch, that we decide to support, is about something that has an emotional truth behind it.
How about you, Greta?
I would definitely agree with everything. I think Adriana and I are going to be agreeing on a lot of things this whole just get used to that. But even beyond that, I think just at macro, I feel like I'm really aligned with just the flexibility that we have in terms of the different kinds of projects that we work on, whether they're like small indie film or really big commercial things or like mid-sized things. So like we get to play in a really cool sandbox where like we can kind of do it all. So I think the most important thing for us is just finding things that feel really unique and authentic, and just a fresh perspective that you haven't seen before. And so I think whether it is a big comedy or a big rom-com or a big, action movie, or if it's like a really small, love story or drama or, prestige sci-fi, like I think all of it is about kind of steering away from those, like Adriana said, the drama things. Like we've had enough, I think, of really traumatic things that happen to our community. And so I think anytime you have the opportunity to tell a story, it's really important to look and see how you can kind of provide a new outlook on something or a new perspective, and also figure out a way to empower. And even though we're not necessarily like a social impact company, I think just by being people of color in general and really, pushing to tell stories in that space, you are making a statement. So like it is just really important for us to find stories and creatives that we feel like are really kind of gonna break through and just show something you haven't seen before.
Right. What was cool is I was on Twitter, and I believe they had the New York premiere of West Side Story last night, which by the way is getting great reviews. And so we're in a year, at least for me, since I've been covering film. I can't remember the last time that we've had a year where we had two major studio releases in the Heights, a West Side Story, that are fronted by Latinx cast. Professionally, how do you feel that these movies, or the box office success of these movies, are going to impact how we getting more Latinx movies greenlit? Do you think this is a good thing? Are we is there some movement, like the conversations you're having behind doors and just seeing how people are reacting to these movies? Where do you think these movies are going to take us into 2022 in the next 5 years?
I mean, those box office are really important. It's really frustrating because like Hollywood feels like if a Latinx movie is not successful in the box office, then that means that you should never make movies about Latinx characters because there's no audience for that. And there's a lot of reasons why that movie particularly wasn't successful. Sometimes it's because it didn't bring the audience or whatever. It doesn't mean that the audience is not there. Actually, like the Latinx community is overperforms the most in the box office, and being 70% of the population, they buy 25% of tickets. But even in my previous life, when I was working at Netflix, there was that argument of like, oh, we don't need necessarily to make more of these kinds of projects because we haven't proven that there's an audience. So there's a lot of stakes behind movies like In the Heights and West Side Story and Father of the Bride that is coming out next year, and Eva's Flaming Hot Cheeto movie, because it feels like we don't have any wiggle room for mistakes. Whereas obviously in a general audience, white director fronted project, there is a lot of room for mistakes, and for there's not that argument that like because a movie directed by a white director wasn't successful, there isn't an audience, there isn't a white audience. And so there is a lot of weight and a lot of pressure for these projects to succeed. And I feel like we all in our community are praying that they do well, because if not, there's going to be a couple of years where the studios are not going to take chances on us.
How about you, Greta?
Yeah, I think there's a lot of unfair pressure put on different communities, not even just Latinos, but whenever really big films like that come out, I think we're definitely further along in the sense of us getting a movie like In the Heights made with that level of Latinx cast and that reach and that kind of budget, and obviously West Side Story too with the casting and that. But I think it's going to be a battle to continue to push through sometimes and especially now, like even just taking COVID into consideration and how that really has been affecting box office in general for like any kind of movie. It's just like a tricky time, and so it feels like a little unfair in that way of like, who knows, but people can still buy things from home online or rent it, but people have different reasons for why they want to go or they don't go, or when they decide to rent something versus when you pay for it first or then it's free on a platform. So there's just like so many different elements to something that is so tricky. But I think the most important thing for everyone to do, even if it's not necessarily like your favorite kind of genre movie or your favorite director, your favorite actor, whatever it is, I think the Latinx community really needs to kind of mobilize and support each other, whatever it is, because I think like Adriana was pointing to, just the number of Latinx moviegoers is so high that if we come together and support each other, then that's going to really help expand the pipeline. And like, just now you're going to get to see even more movies that have Latinos, and that maybe it could be a space movie, maybe it could be a horror movie, maybe it could be a pure comedy. Like it just really opens other doors. So it's definitely a concerted effort in just one, supporting each other and going to see whatever it is, and then two, I think not being kind of put off by when maybe box office numbers don't meet things, and really kind of advocating for ourselves with studios and with the buyers of like, this is a really unfair expectation for Latino movies, because you don't say that for like a white person movie, for example, to like put it super bluntly, like, if one comedy with like, I don't know, X name big actor doesn't work out, it's not like they're never allowed to make a movie ever again. They're kind of like, well, that one just didn't do that great, so we'll do another one. And it's like, we don't get that opportunity, right? So I think it's just being gracious and really thinking about that on like the studio head buyer side, but then also just what we as a community can do on our own way is like just show up for each other and support. And like that is really going to continue to be like, hey, we're here and we're supporting each other. And the more you do it, the more kinds of things that you're going to get to see that you want to see.
Yeah. It's so annoying because like I was reading the box office reports for this weekend, and Encanto did great. Encanto had a really strong weekend, and yet the headline has been it was a depressed Thanksgiving weekend and the movie is not doing that great because of COVID is hitting it. And so like even how like journalists write about these stories, they hurt sometimes the movies early on by creating this idea of failure around the project that is not necessarily a failure because they used the wrong data or whatever. Like it really annoyed me when I read the way they're framing Encanto's release weekend.
Yeah, it's funny, like having this conversation is like I see so many parallels in the conversations about Black film, right? Like I remember this was years ago when the Best Man Holiday, the sequel to Best Man Holiday, and most of the mainstream box office pundits and critics were like, oh, we don't think this movie is gonna do that well. And then it was, I think it was like number one or number two that opening weekend, and then the headlines were like, oh, it overperformed, which is equally insulting because you're saying like you didn't expect it to do anything at all, right? So I was just sort of like,
oh yeah, when I
okay,
was with
yeah.
Eugenio Derbez, I remember when we released How to Be a Latin Lover, all the box office previews were about how they were estimating the movie was going to do about 4 or 5 million in opening weekend. The tracking was really low, and they weren't really looking at the Latinx community in the tracking, without like understanding that the Latinx community is usually undermeasured during tracking, but then they show up at the box office. But because,
and that's insane to think about with Eugenio too, because his biggest supportive fan base is like Latinos, because that is
yeah,
where he started.
But like the people who were writing those articles, who are probably like white, don't really think about this. They don't even consider it because it's not. It's a little bit of an unconscious bias. It's not. They're not conscious of it. And so when the movie premiered in number one that weekend, and it made $14 million in the weekend, so it made 4 times what they were expecting, everybody was surprised. And it wasn't a surprise. It tracked in line with Eugenio's movies from the past, but again, it was the way the industry was framing it, and it's very frustrating the way that even when we have successes, they don't frame them as successes.
Yeah. And I wanted to ask you guys about streaming because, of course, now it's kind of changed everything, right? Like I logged into Netflix this morning, and they have their top 10, and at least half of the top 10 shows or movies were fronted by people of color, right? There's Kevin Hart's series, Squid Games is still going strong, and so I feel like there's 2 different conversations going on where they're just like, well, they don't want to see people of color. But yet, clearly, when you go to like the streaming platforms, the best performing shows, and then I think on Netflix, they have Hentify just premiered 2 weeks ago. And so there's definitely Latinx content that's doing well on streaming. What are your thoughts about how streaming is impacting or helping more Latinx representation?
Well, I'm just going to start with a caveat that like, and I shouldn't be saying a lot of this because it's internal stuff, but the top 10 lists are very dependent of the day and time that you look at the top 10 lists. So, and they don't quite give you the full picture of what the data means, because something could be on the top 10 that week and still be a failure within like the way Netflix measures success of a show. Because sometimes something can be watched very aggressively on day one, and then it has a big drop off. And so I would just say, like, let's look at the top 10 with a grain of salt. And because it doesn't give you the full picture. The thing that does give you the full picture is the data that they do have on what something is successful or not. The success of Bridgerton is undeniable. And so that one, for example, is very easy to say, okay, this show with this diverse cast is a success. And Netflix particularly has been really aggressive in casting diverse, not necessarily hiring diverse in terms of writers and directors. They're working on it, but and they probably are one of the companies that is a little most ahead, but they are more conscious of it in the casting process than in the hiring process.
Interesting.
I'd say on the content side, I feel good about just having streamers, especially places like Netflix, because apart from being able to finance and create new content and support creatives, like they can just buy a lot of stuff that's already made. And so even just buying a regular show, a small show or a small movie, and just putting it on a platform where practically anyone can access it who has a membership, already starts like pointing people to a slate of films or shows that they probably would have never thought to watch. And so now they're starting to watch it. And that's when you get into the niche space of like, when would we have ever found Squid Game on like TV randomly? You know, like probably not. It's because it was on that top 10 algorithm from Netflix, you know? And so I think it's a great thing for a lot of different creatives, because just having a place that has a lot of financing and that they just really want to fill up, you know, their slate, their catalog of projects, like to put your project on their platform, I think is excellent, because people will watch it. People always find stuff. I think, like Adriana said, in terms of, you know, the hiring end of things, I feel like I've certainly seen a big push with just especially I think on our end too, with Macro having, and somebody said shout out to Hentified, but like having our show there, our first Latinx show there with them, and just seeing how like representation for Latinx content has grown over the past couple years, with like, I know them launching those initiatives. Like I think it's Con Todo, right? Is that what it's called?
Well, Con Todo is a channel on social media that speaks particularly to, it's kind of like a strong Black lead, but for the Latinx community.
Mm-hmm.
And the incubator thing is something a little separate, but yeah.
Even just creating those channels though is already doing way more than like another studio or another streamer hasn't done yet. And it's really smart in the way that it's social and it gets viral and people start sharing it with each other. And so like, I think there's a lot of really great positives to, you know, to Netflix and what they're doing. And obviously they're still growing and it's still early on in how they're representing Latinos specifically. And that goes beyond, again, just the talent. It's with executives, it's with producers, it's with writers, directors, it's with all of it, crews. But I think, you know, they're going to be around for a long time, and it's just the beginning. So I think it's on all of us to, you know, to hold them accountable whenever they're able to hire Latinx crew or creatives or producers or directors, you know, all those kinds of things when we're working with them.
The amazing thing about Netflix, again, coming from an insider, compared to other of the streaming platforms, really is the power of the algorithm. Because the algorithm gives a project just the ability to succeed on its own without needing marketing or being found or even word of mouth. The algorithm itself is word of mouth because you get recommended something that is like popular and tailored for you. Obviously, like word of mouth is also important, but like a show that is excellent and diverse that I don't even know what platform it is, but We Are Lady Parts. I've heard a lot of it being conversed in the outside world, and it's been really hard to find it or to be like, you know, marketed for it on my end. Versus like, because the algorithm in Netflix really does hit you with like whatever is popular at the moment, things that are catching fire catch fire quicker. And there's none of this argument of like, oh, it's because the marketing campaign was too small, or or like we didn't reach people where they are at. Like the algorithm really does hit people where they're at their houses when they're watching with the control in their hands. And that's allowed, it removes a little of the gatekeeping because you have a democratizing tool showing you what people are watching.
Right. So we're talking about representation, because I remember there was a report, I think it came out last year or maybe 2019, that was tracking the representation of Latinx characters on television. And I believe the number one, the representation was just like less than 5%. And then what was really shocking or rather disappointing was the kind of representation. I think they said over half of the characters that were of Latinx descent on these shows had like some sort of criminal aspect, or it was like a negative depiction of Latinx. So in your respective positions, like how are you using your platform to kind of combat these kind of negative depictions and getting more people, because I think part of the problem too is that the people who are writing these stories and these characters are not of Latinx descent themselves. They're not from the community. What are your thoughts on that, as far as like the representation Latinx have had up until this point, and how you feel that you can change it going forward?
I think it's definitely on us to give constructive criticism, and just our knowledge of what's out there in the space. I think like these places, again, going back to the algorithm kind of concept, and like what performs well, a lot of places continue to go back to over and over again because it does well for them every time, and that means it makes money for them. And I think there's plenty of drug cartel kinds of stories in that space. And I think, again, when we can band together and really support something that's maybe not that starts to kind of open a different narrative of different kinds of stories or places Latinos are in or people they can be. I think that is going to be a really big part of it. But just internally, like, I think it starts with us anyways, Adriana and I, of like what kinds of projects we decide to take on to work on at our companies. And if it's, I know I can speak for us on my end anyways, we try really hard to I don't think we really have projects in that space. Because we're not really interested in seeing, we're more wanting to see Latinos now or in the future and doing things we just haven't seen them do yet. There's like such a wide range first of Latinos in general from different countries, and we're all so different, but we're also really banded together by like different beautiful elements of our cultures that, really bring us together. So I think it starts with where you're at and what you can kind of take on and then push through to get made into the studios, and then if it's something in that space that is shared with you and you're not able to do, I think even just giving your feedback or giving advice on like how to make it maybe work a little bit better or make it fit into whatever space whoever is sharing it with wants to take it to, I think is a good thing too, to just have like an honest conversation of like, well, just, I think I try and do that a lot whenever we get things that maybe is not a fit, try and be really helpful in the sense of like, just so you know, there's X show or Y movie that already exists here that is like in this space. So you might want to consider changing this or updating this, or like, here's why I think it's probably not a good time for something like this. I think whenever we can kind of do that, it'll really help to change who works on what, or just even being honest, like you were saying about if it's somebody who's not Latino or not a person of color working on something, and just saying that. I don't know if it's a good idea, or maybe you shouldn't make this into that version of it because it's probably just not the right way to do it,
Yeah, I mean, for us, since we are the ones driving those projects that are heavy on Latinx representation, we're clear where we have where we can work on, right? Because we know that we don't want to do the trauma stories, and we know like the type of things that we do want to elevate. That's great. Then there's all the other things that we really can control, like our projects, we might be like 2% or like 0.1% of everything that's in the marketplace. We can control what we can control, but we can't control all the other projects that are being made out there. A thing that we can do though is shame people when those projects come out, and every single one of those reports helps us continue having this conversation and shaming people. And I've been exposed in my time at Netflix at resources that are offered to both executives and creators when they're working on a space that is not necessarily familiar to them. For example, if you're doing a show that is very focused on the LGBT community, we have experts. We used to work with GLAAD to come in and consult, or I had a show that in Mexico that was focused on racial and socioeconomical divide. And it was a comedy, but we made sure that we brought in two different experts in colorism and discrimination to make sure that like the things that we were making fun of were coming from a place of let's have a discussion and then hopefully like elevate those communities rather than putting people down, which was the point of view of the showrunners in that show. So those types of tools are available, but you need to shame the people who are making those things so that we can constantly change and move and evolve those cliches and stereotypes. And the other thing is like by making the things that we are making, we can make, we are slowly but surely changing the narrative and evolving the conversation and removing those stereotypes. And so the thing that we can control is not perpetuating those stereotypes, making sure that the things that we tell are aspirational and not also doing another story about drug dealers and narcos. So for us, we are very clear that we don't want to do border crossing stories or drug lords and narcos and things where I call them poor people in the desert stories. And I hate that description, but like where we're just perpetrating one and over and over the same narrative that has been fed to us a million times. Like, why can't we see Latinos that are successful and that are doctors and lawyers and scientists, and why can we tell stories that are coming from another point of view? But it is very hard when the industry is so large and you can't control everybody in it. The one thing I can say is that depending on where we're sitting, sometimes we're sitting on the producer side, sometimes we're sitting on the executive side. I jump around a lot. And so like when I was at Netflix, you can be intentional in if you're involved in a project and that project has a white writer and suddenly like the Latinx characters in that project are a little bit cliched, it is your responsibility as an executive to have that conversation with that executive, with that writer, and perhaps give them the tools or the resources that are necessary for them to, change their mind a little bit. But it kind of depends on where you're sitting within the industry.
So I'm going to take some questions from our viewers. One question is from Robin Pascal. The question is, how are you finding new Latinx projects to support at your companies? Are all of your creatives coming to you already repped?
Oh, sorry, Diana, are you going to go?
Nothing.
I mean, we get a lot of stuff from like the traditional talent agencies or management companies, reps. Not everyone is always reps. I feel like we, on our end at Macro, try really hard to participate, like I mentioned before, in different festivals. So we'll track filmmakers if we see them somewhere and we're fans of them. We'll do things with different schools, with like AFI or LMU or Film Dependent, like just being a part of all the Sundance programs as well, being a part of just looking in other spaces, even finding people on like, Vimeo, you find a short that you really like, or I think we live in this digital age and it's really up to you to like find all these different things. You could find somebody on Instagram or TikTok, or there's just so much out there that you don't have to necessarily depend on the traditional, aspects of Hollywood with the talent agencies and the management companies that send you material. And because a big part of it too, of just breaking new talent and supporting upcoming voices, is they're not going to be in those spaces yet because those are not easy to access. So it's really training yourself to look in other areas. And I think similar to what we were saying earlier, again, it's just a lot of things through relationships with people, with friends in the industry that are, might have seen a really cool short somebody did or read a script, or it's a lot of internal sharing materials with one another. And so that's another, really big part of helping just get people out there is the community support whenever you can.
I mean, the reason why there's the whole, you cannot receive projects that are not from writers or directors that are not rep. It comes from a making sure that whoever you're working with is vouched for. So that doesn't mean that everything needs to come from a rep, but it has to be vouched for by a school, by a strong social media following, by recommendations from other people that you know and trust, because obviously our industry is so it's so social. So you have to like make sure that you're working with people that are not crazy. And so like that's kind of what that agency being repped filter is, but it's not the only way. And it just means that we're looking for people that can be vouched for and that we can trust that we're gonna have a fruitful relationship when we're working for 2 or 3 years and millions of dollars are involved, right? But yeah, it not the only avenue is not necessarily reps, but it is through people that you know, or through programs, or through festivals, or.
Okay. So what have been some of your that you've experienced as far as like internal or external roadblocks you faced while shepherding Latinx voices and creatives, and how did your company respond to that?
I mean, a big roadblock is that the people that you sell to that don't necessarily understand something, and you have to do a lot of educating because they don't see it the way you necessarily see it, because they don't quite, are immersed in that community. And so like a really hard thing to do is when you're pitching at a company and nobody gets it, and you have to do a lot of selling, a lot of educating, and the only way you can continue to do it is by continuing to do it. Hopefully there will be more executives of color in the next few years, but I think that is a big roadblock for Latinx projects.
Greta?
Yeah, I think I'm happy to give like a specific example. When we were, I executive produced our first Latinx movie, Blast Beat. That was a Latino coming of age set in '99 about this kid who was this total metalhead, but like loved science and wanted to be an astrophysicist and work at NASA one day. And that was like just such a cool, different story that we hadn't heard before. And so we went out and found that story on our own without agency sending that into us. And it was like a first time filmmaker that we developed the script with. And, making that movie was, such a feat for us. Even just finding the right financing partners for it, which we, in the end, macro financed it solely, and Sony acquired it. But, just the wall that we hit with the different places that we would send the script to look for co-financiers. And a lot of the people that were Adriana and I's peers, who weren't even necessarily Latinos, really enjoyed the script and got it. And then the second that they had to push it up to like the higher up superiors, they were like, we just don't get it, or don't see what it is, or, it's not a fit for us. So I'd say that was like the very real layer of like, again, until we become studio heads or people with green light power, buying power, financing power, things aren't really fully going to change. But between that, or between fighting, I know other friends fighting to cast things with a certain piece of talent, or getting companies to think about a certain topic, or there's just so many different variations of it. And I think the best thing that you can do is like be really bullish about it, like be super passionate about it, because that, if it's on you and you have the ability to really push it through, then like we need to do that. Otherwise projects are just not going to get made. And all it takes is one person or one yes or one, sign off on something to really help start pushing it through and get it made. And like we made the movie in the end, and like it's so, like we did it. It was the hardest movie ever to make, but it was so rewarding, because like just beyond just it being a really interesting piece of cinema and supporting a new filmmaker, like it started to open up a little bit more. Like we're saying, every Latino movie that comes out opens the door a bit further. So as frustrating as that is, all it takes is one person, the right person, to get it and, you know, take something on. And so we all just, again, have to, I'm very kumbaya, but like we have to support each other in whatever position we're in of power at another company or the studio. Like, it's really important for us to really make the most of it.
Right. I have a question for you guys. As far as the casting of these projects, how important, because we know we've had a history of in Hollywood where they would cast non-Latinx people, actors or actresses, to play Latino characters, and sometimes we put them in brown face. So how important, when you have a project, a Latinx project, how important is it as far as the authenticity to cast Latinx actors and actresses in those roles?
Very.
I think that's always the goal, for sure.
Mm-hmm.
And Latinas are so picky too. Like, we know when somebody's Mexican or not, or when somebody's Puerto Rican or Dominican or, you know, Colombian. The Colombian accent is so specific. For Blast Beat, we fully cast it Colombian. Wilmer Valderrama is half Colombian, half Venezuelan. Like, his accent was like a little different because he's like, you know, two different parents, but like we knew you can't fake that. I mean, you could really, that's what an actor is obviously they play a role, but I think whenever you can be authentic, it's really important. So and the short list of talent for certain studios isn't very long. That's why it's a short list, so it can get tricky at times, but we, I think, are also responsible for breaking new talent to like start changing the lineup of those lists too.
Right. There's a question. Can you talk about international markets and audiences, how they play into the determination of how something gets promoted or considered successful?
It depends. Because international, it is factored, especially on studio movies, it is a very important component, and especially big markets like China. And so there's conversations internally about whether something is going to be successful in China or not, and whether a piece of talent is going to make a project more appealing to those markets internationally or not. There is this misconception in a lot of studios that you know, projects with Black leads or brown leads don't travel well, and so that determines what budget a film gets assigned, because if they assume that there's going to be no international, then they're going to assume that this project is going to have a smaller budget. And so it's definitely a conversation that it is had. Now, if you, for example, talk about a Netflix where China and Russia are not markets for them at this moment, then the conversation is different, because Brazil is a huge market for Netflix, and Latin America and Spain are huge. And so for them, those are the markets that they want to hit, because those are like the top, within the top 10. Mexico is an important market. Spain is an important market. Brazil are important. So it's a different conversation, because China, for example, doesn't factor in, but India does. And the India base is super important at Netflix. So there's a lot of stunt casting that happens in Netflix movies. For example, what they did in what was that Adam Sandler movie, the Halloween one? No, the Murder Mystery. Casting Luis Gerardo Mendez was a stunt casting to attract the viewers in Mexico and Latin America, because they know that that's an important market. So the international, it depends on how that studio in particular is financing those movies.
Other question is, are there distributors or platforms that seem more willing to go into Latinx markets? I know we mentioned Netflix. Are there any other streaming studios that you see are making a more concerted effort into more Latinx representation?
I think Lionsgate / Pantaleon, knowing that they can't really compete with the big five, big four now. They're focusing on the smaller niche movies that they can. That's why like Lionsgate has focused on a lot of Black movies, and they have the overall deal with Eugenio. So I think Lionsgate is one that is willing to go into Latinx, but I think Amazon and Apple and now HBO Max and now Disney Plus, they're all once they're like now that they've hit those international markets, they're going to start seeing which territories are going to grow and which territories are not going to grow and which territories are going to be priorities and which territories are not going to be priorities. So we are in a moment of a lot of change, and we'll see in the next 5 years what all of this means to our
It's
industry.
all a numbers game for sure. It's a business at the end of the day. So I think, yeah, definitely the places that have the streaming platforms are going to be pushing for things, whether it's Latinx content or something else, but because it all kind of ties back to, yeah, where do they overperform? Where do they underperform? Where do they need to do better? And, you know, everyone wants to be the best in whatever space, and that's fine as long as you let us make more Latinx content. So
Yeah.
I think we will all take advantage of that for sure.
Which is why like I keep saying like we need to make things that are commercial. Like for the only way for Latinx storytelling to continue moving forward is for it to be successful in the box office, because we need to like, because of this pressure that everything that you do has to be successful or you can never make a Latino movie ever again, we have to make a bunch of successful stuff. That is the pressure right now, for us to continue building our community and open the door that like is a little open, but like it needs to be more open. That I think that's kind of what the Black community has done so well, that like those movies are successful. They are business. We have to make our community a business.
If you had your dream project as far as like adapting a novel from a Latinx author, or if you could remake one of your favorite movies with an all Latinx cast, what would it be?
I'm a massive fan of Wes Anderson. So for the longest time, I've always talked about finding a creative that's Latinx in that space. Like, why can't we have our own person that thinks in that way? And so definitely is a dream of mine to work on content that feels really quirky and fun and super charming and really like touches a lot of people, just like Wes does with his films. And I don't know, I feel like a lot of the things that I responded to growing up, it was a mix of Latino classic films, but then a lot of like non-POC films, just like people films, honestly, which is great. It's not a bad thing. It's awesome. But it's just like a testament to like, obviously how wide of a range of tastes people have. Like we all, you know, we could like, you know, punk rock one day and then like country music another day or something. So I think it's just finding, for me anyways, the stories that kind of play in those spaces that I've always been such a fan of growing up, and like that made me love cinema, and figuring out how to replicate that with like, you know, our own communities in it.
I'm going to say something that's going to sound a little stupid. I want to be able to see a movie like Jurassic World, but the lead be Latino. Like I want to see something gigantic, that is so high concept, but with us in as the leads. That would make me really happy. And those are the kinds
I think that's already happening to a certain extent with like the Oscar Isaacs, with like Pedro Pascal, with, you know, but not nearly enough. So I think the good news is that's probably going to start hopefully happening more, but yeah, I totally agree with you too.
And the other thing is that like specifically with Pedro Pascal and Oscar Isaac, their identity is not part of the character. They're both in, you know, Star Wars universe type movies where like there aren't Latinos in the Star Wars universe. It's a galaxy far, far away. But like, I would like to see it be celebrated in a movie of that size.
Question from the audience. Can both of you talk a little bit about how you got into development and what were your strengths going in?
I didn't know what development was. I'm from Monterrey, a big city in Mexico, but I like to say it's a small town because like we didn't have an entertainment industry. I love the theater. So I got into this world because I'm a sensitive, artistic soul, even though I'm also really good at math. And I used to work on set in physical production back in the day. I started in the art department, became a production coordinator when I was 21. And then I fell in love with LA. I took a year abroad, shot a bunch of short films. I thought I wanted to be a director. And then I was really upset when my mommy made me go back to Monterrey and graduate. And I applied to grad school on a whim of like, I sold my jewelry and I was like, I'm going to apply to grad school because my parents weren't going to support me. And I was really lucky to fall into a thing called the Peter Stark Producing Program, which is a great master's program. And it focuses on the business of producing, not production, producing. And so most of our classes were around development. And that made me fall in love with development and screenwriting and how to give notes. And because my brain is a little math driven, I love structure. But because I'm also a very sensitive soul, I love characters. And so like for me, it sort of felt like the right space to be in. And every single job that I had has moved in that space. And I just, the more you give notes, the better you get at giving notes. And I've had really great mentors. And I was really lucky that at Netflix, I launched more than 25 shows or movies. So that made me really on top of my game in terms of giving notes because I had to give them all day long, every day. And so I think my strengths are structure, definitely.
For me, I took a basics of producing class when I was in undergrad at UCLA. And before then I knew I wasn't going to be a director, writer, or actor. And so I really specifically, intentionally took this like basics of producing to see what it was all about. And similar to Adriana, really enjoyed the creative element of it all, with being able to read things and like build your tastes and figure out what the kinds of things that you want to support and make into a feature film, and just having the brain to think about all the different elements that go into like making a movie and following it from the beginning to the end. And so that's really when I was like, I think I want to do this. I got an internship at Temple Hill while I was still at UCLA, and got to, read a bunch of scripts and do coverage and hear the executives there talk about, why they like something and not, and hear them watching dailies and giving notes on things. And so I just thought like, this is so cool. And this feels like exactly how I can put my strengths forward in terms of just giving feedback and helping put together a project. So I think some of my strengths going in was just the fact that I had an eye for specifically Latinx content at Macro, and really wanting to push that forward and support it.
This has been really fascinating, y'all. It's so important for us to have like candid conversations like this about what we're seeing and what's going on, with power production houses like you guys, and just assessing and keeping a pulse on what's going down. So I'm really grateful that y'all are here and having that conversation with us. It is time for our networking portion of the evening. Thank you so much, Adriana and Greta, for coming on and talking with us, and giving us some of your tidbits of wisdom. I definitely learned a lot. It's a really complicated conversation. There's a lot of layers, and it's certainly not solved here in this one chat. So, we hope to see you both at some of our other programming too. We hope to have board member Margie Moreno on with us as well. and just continuing excavating what the puzzle and the mystery of trying to push forward the Latinx community in our industry. So thank you so much for joining us here.